The hallways of Westfield Academy gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Not a speck of dust dared settle on the polished floors or the trophy cases that lined the walls. This was Carlos Hernandez's doing. For 12 years, he had worked as the head janitor at this prestigious private school, taking immense pride in maintaining its spotless appearance, even if most people barely noticed him as he moved quietly through the corridors. Carlos arrived at school each morning before the sun rose, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel of his old blue pickup truck. The vehicle had seen better days, much like Carlos himself, with crow's feet deepening around his eyes from years of early mornings and late nights. Today, however, was special. His daughter Maria would be joining him, transferring to Westfield Academy as a sophomore. "Are you nervous?" Carlos asked in Spanish, glancing at the 15-year-old girl beside him. She stared out the passenger window, her fingers unconsciously moving as if playing an invisible instrument. "A little," Maria admitted, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She wore the standard Westfield uniform, navy blazer, plaid skirt, white button-up shirt, yet it seemed to hang differently on her slender frame compared to the other students whose parents could afford the perfect tailoring. "Remember, you earned your place here," Carlos said firmly. "The scholarship committee saw something special in you." Maria nodded, though uncertainty clouded her eyes. What Carlos didn't say was that her scholarship only covered 70% of the tuition. The remaining 30% came from his savings and extra weekend cleaning jobs. Some months he survived on rice and beans to make the payments, but Maria would never know this. As they pulled into the staff parking lot, several luxury cars glided past them toward the student drop-off zone. Carlos noticed Maria shrinking in her seat. "Head up," he reminded her gently. "You are just as good as any of them." They parted ways at the service entrance, Carlos heading to the maintenance office and Maria toward the administration building to get her class schedule. Before she left, Carlos pressed something into her palm, a small wooden charm shaped like a violin. "For luck," he said, squeezing her hand. Maria smiled for the first time that morning, slipping the charm into her pocket before walking away. The first half of Maria's day passed in a blur of new faces, confusing hallways, and teachers who spoke with polished accents that made her feel self-conscious about her own slight Hispanic lilt. During each class introduction, she felt the curious stares of her classmates, who seemed to silently assess everything from her unbranded shoes to her lack of the latest smartphone. By lunchtime, Maria needed space to breathe. Instead of heading to the crowded cafeteria, she wandered the halls until she found herself near the music department. The sound of a piano drew her toward a practice room, but as she peeked through the window, she saw it was occupied by two girls working on what appeared to be a duet. Moving further down the hallway, Maria discovered another practice room, this one empty. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The small space contained only a piano, a music stand, and a chair. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, Maria felt her shoulders relax. From her backpack, she carefully removed a worn violin case. The case itself told a story, scuffed at the corners with a faded sticker of a music note on the front, and a handle wrapped with duct tape where the original covering had worn away. But what it contained was Maria's most precious possession. 6 years ago, on her 9th birthday, Carlos had presented her with this second-hand violin. He had found it at a pawn shop and spent 3 months making payments to bring it home. The instrument wasn't perfect. The varnish had worn thin in spots, and one of the fine tuners was slightly bent. But to Maria, it was everything. "Your mother played," Carlos had told her when he gave her the gift. She always said music was a language that needed no translation. Maria's mother had passed away when she was just 4 years old. The violin became her connection to a woman whose face grew hazier in her memory with each passing year. With no money for formal lessons, Maria had taught herself to play using YouTube tutorials, free online resources, and borrowed books from the public library. What she lacked in formal training, she made up for in determination and raw talent. Hours upon hours of practice had calloused her fingertips and strengthened her wrists. Now, in the quiet practice room, Maria lifted the violin to her shoulder, positioning it with the practiced ease of someone who had done so thousands of times. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. She started with scales to warm up, her fingers dancing along the fingerboard as naturally as breathing. Then she moved into a piece she had been working on for months, Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons. The music flowed from her instrument, filling the small room with sound that seemed too big, too powerful to come from such a small girl and her old violin. Maria lost herself in the music, unaware of the passage of time or the tears that had begun to slip down her cheeks. Playing always did this to her, transported her somewhere else, somewhere her worries couldn't follow. Here, there were no scholarship concerns, no whispered comments about her accent, no stares at her second-hand uniform. She didn't hear the door open, didn't notice the two teachers who paused in the hallway, drawn by the unexpected music coming from what should have been an empty room. Ms. Pamela Walsh and Mr. Gregory. Tanner exchanged glances as they listened. Ms. Walsh taught advanced music theory and directed the school orchestra. Mr. Tanner was the strings instructor who worked primarily with the school's elite chamber ensemble. Both were alumni of prestigious conservatories and had performed with renowned orchestras before turning to teaching at Westfield, where wealthy parents ensured their children received instruction from only the best. Interesting technique, Ms. Walsh whispered, her perfectly plucked eyebrow arching upward. Self-taught? Obviously, Mr. Tanner replied with a slight smirk. The phrasing is all wrong and her posture. He made a tisking sound. They continued to listen, their professional ears picking out every technical flaw while failing to recognize the heart behind the performance. When Maria finally finished the piece, the sudden silence seemed to snap her back to reality. She lowered her violin and opened her eyes, only then noticing her audience. She froze, violin still in hand, bow hanging loosely from her fingers. That was interesting, Ms. Walsh said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone delivering critique. Maria felt her face flush hot with embarrassment. I'm sorry, she stammered. I didn't know. I thought the room was available for practice. These rooms are for students enrolled in the music program, Mr. Tanner explained, his gaze flicking dismissively over Maria's violin. Do you take lessons with one of our instructors? No, sir, Maria replied, hastily returning her violin to its case. I'm new. Today is my first day. A flash of recognition crossed Ms. Walsh's face. You're the scholarship student, aren't you? The janitor's daughter. The way she said janitor made the word sound like something distasteful. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she closed the violin case, the latch making a soft click that seemed too loud in the sudden tension of the room. Yes, ma'am. My father is Carlos Hernandez. Mr. Tanner's expression shifted subtly. Ah, Carlos. He's always very thorough with the practice rooms. Make sure the pianos are kept dust-free. His tone was pleasant enough, but something in his eyes made Maria feel small, as if her father's job somehow diminished her right to be in this room, to hold a violin, to play music that wasn't hers to play. Where did you study before transferring here? Ms. Walsh asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Eastside Public, Maria answered quietly, naming the underfunded school across town where most of the working-class students attended. I wasn't aware they had a strings program, Mr. Tanner commented. They don't, Maria said. I taught myself. The two teachers exchanged another glance, this one tinged with amusement that they tried to hide. Well, Ms. Walsh said after a moment, you've certainly shown initiative. The winter showcase is coming up in a few weeks. Perhaps you'd like to audition? There was something in her voice, a challenge maybe, or a test, that made Maria hesitate. But then she thought of her father, of his constant encouragement, of the sacrifices he made that he thought she didn't notice. Yes, Maria said, straightening her shoulders slightly. I would like to audition. Wonderful, Mr. Tanner said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The auditions are next Friday after school. You'll need to prepare a classical piece of your choosing, something appropriate for your skill level. Maria nodded, clutching her violin case close to her chest like a shield. We should get going, Gregory, Ms. Walsh said. We have that department meeting. As they turned to leave, Maria heard Mr. Tanner murmur to Ms. Walsh, this should be entertaining, at least. Maria stood alone in the practice room long after they'd gone, the weight of their judgment heavier than her backpack and violin combined. Part of her wanted to run, to find her father and tell him she'd made a terrible mistake, that she didn't belong here among these polished people with their expensive instruments and years of proper training. But another part of her, a stronger part that sounded suspiciously like her father, whispered that running would only prove them right. Maria slipped her violin case back into her backpack and squared her shoulders. The bell would ring soon, calling students back to class. She would go to her next lesson, hold her head high, and pretend this encounter had never happened. And tonight, when she got home to their small apartment, she would practice until her fingers ached and her arms felt like lead, because Maria Hernandez was many things: a janitor's daughter, a scholarship student, a girl who still missed her mother. But above all, she was someone who refused to be defined by what others thought she could or couldn't do. The next few days passed in a blur for Maria. She settled into a routine at Westfield Academy, keeping her head down during classes, eating lunch alone in quiet corners, and avoiding the music department entirely. The encounter with Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Each morning, Carlos would drop her off with words of encouragement. "Remember, Pequeña, you belong there just as much as anyone else." But as the sleek cars pulled up alongside their worn pickup truck, Maria found it harder to believe him. On Thursday afternoon, Maria sat in history class, half listening to a lecture about the Renaissance when the teacher mentioned something that caught her attention. Music was considered an essential part of a well-rounded education, Mrs. Chen explained. The wealthy would hire private tutors to teach their children to play instruments as a sign of status and cultivation. A girl named Lily raised her hand. "Like how our parents hire instructors for us now?" Mrs. Chen nodded. "Yes, very similar. Though today we recognize that musical talent isn't restricted to those with means. Some of history's greatest musicians came from humble beginnings." Maria felt a small spark ignite within her chest. She thought of her violin waiting in her locker, of the audition tomorrow that she had nearly convinced herself to skip. When the final bell rang, she made a decision. Instead of heading straight to the pickup point where her father would be waiting, Maria detoured to her locker and retrieved her violin case. "Dad," she said when she climbed into the truck, "can you pick me up an hour later tomorrow? There's something I need to do after school." Carlos looked at her curiously but nodded. "Of course. Is everything okay?" "Yes," Maria said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There's an audition for the winter showcase. I want to try." Pride bloomed across Carlos's face. "That's wonderful. Your mother would be so proud." That night, Maria practiced with renewed determination. Their small apartment filled with music as she worked through Vivaldi's Winter again and again. Focusing on the technical aspects she knew Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner would be scrutinizing. Carlos sat in their tiny living room, eyes closed, listening. When Maria finally lowered her violin exhausted, he looked at her with misty eyes. "Perfect," he said simply. Maria shook her head. "Not yet. But it will be." Friday came too quickly. Classes dragged on endlessly, yet somehow the final bell rang before Maria felt ready. She gathered her things and made her way to the music department, her heart pounding so hard she feared others might hear it. The auditorium was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. Students with expensive instruments chatted in small groups, some warming up with impressive-sounding scales and arpeggios. Maria recognized several from her classes, though none had spoken to her beyond the obligatory introductions. At a table near the stage sat Ms. Walsh, Mr. Tanner, and an older man Maria hadn't seen before. They had clipboards and stern expressions, occasionally making notes as students performed. Maria found a seat in the back row, removed her violin, and began to quietly tune it. A boy with perfectly styled hair glanced over, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her instrument. "Is that a rental?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than mocking. Maria shook her head. "It was my mother's," she lied, finding it easier than explaining about the pawn shop. The boy nodded and turned back to his own violin, a gleaming instrument that looked like it cost more than a year of her father's salary. One by one, students were called to the stage. Each performance was technically impressive, if somewhat lacking in emotion. Maria watched, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. These students had been playing for years with private instructors. What had made her think she could compete? "Maria Hernandez," Ms. Walsh finally called, consulting her clipboard with mild surprise, as if she hadn't expected Maria to actually show up. The room fell into a hush as Maria walked toward the stage, her old violin case clutched in her hands. She felt the stares, heard the whispers. "Isn't she the new girl? I think her dad's the janitor. Does she even take lessons?" Maria kept her eyes forward, focusing on the stage rather than the curious faces. She climbed the steps, positioned herself in the center, and took a deep breath. "What will you be playing for us today?" Mr. Tanner asked, pen poised over his clipboard. Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons First Movement, Maria answered, her voice smaller than she intended. Ms. Walsh raised an eyebrow. That's quite ambitious. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something simpler? Maria met her gaze. I'm sure. She lifted her violin to her shoulder and positioned her bow. The auditorium fell silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy with expectation. Maria closed her eyes for just a moment, picturing her father's encouraging smile, remembering the way her mother had looked in the one photograph they had of her playing. Head slightly tilted, eyes bright with passion. She began to play. The first notes were shaky, betraying her nerves. But as she continued, something shifted. The music took over, flowing through her as naturally as breathing. She forgot about the audience, about the teacher's judgment, about the whispers and stares. There was only the violin, the bow, and Vivaldi's centuries-old notes brought to life through her fingers. When the final note faded, Maria opened her eyes. The auditorium remained silent for a moment before scattered applause broke out. Not enthusiastic, but polite. Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner huddled together, whispering and making notes. The older man simply watched her with an unreadable expression. Thank you, Maria, Ms. Walsh said finally. We'll post the showcase lineup on Monday. Maria nodded, gathered her things, and hurried from the stage. She wanted nothing more than to escape, to find her father waiting in the pickup truck, to go home where her violin was a source of joy rather than judgment. As she pushed through the auditorium doors, she heard footsteps behind her. Hey, wait up! Maria turned to see the boy with the perfect hair jogging to catch up with her. I'm Alex, he said when he reached her. Your playing was really good. Maria eyed him suspiciously, searching for signs of mockery. Thanks. No, seriously, he insisted. You play differently than the rest of us, more, I don't know, real? Before Maria could respond, the auditorium doors opened again. Ms. Walsh emerged, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Alex, your mother called. She's waiting for you out front. Alex nodded. See you around, he said to Maria before heading down the hall. Ms. Walsh remained, her gaze falling to Maria's violin case. That was an interesting performance, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Your technique is quite unconventional. Maria said nothing, unsure how to respond to what felt like criticism wrapped in a compliment. How long have you been playing? Ms. Walsh asked. 6 years, Maria answered. And your teacher? Maria hesitated. I don't have one. Not officially. I learned from videos and books. Ms. Walsh's expression shifted, something like amusement crossing her features. Well, that explains it. You know, Maria, music isn't something you can simply teach yourself. It requires proper instruction, years of training and understanding of theory and composition. She paused, especially for pieces like Vivaldi. The spark that had been growing in Maria's chest throughout the day began to flicker and dim. The Winter Showcase is our most prestigious event. Ms. Walsh continued. Parents, alumni, donors, they all attend. We have a reputation to maintain. Maria understood the implication. She wasn't good enough. She didn't belong. I should go, she said quietly. My dad's waiting. Ms. Walsh nodded, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Have a good weekend, Maria. Maria hurried down the corridor, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She had nearly reached the exit when she heard voices around the corner, actually considering her for the showcase. Mr. Tanner was saying, his voice low but clear in the empty hallway. Dean Wilson seemed impressed, replied a voice Maria didn't recognize. Said she played with passion, Mr. Tanner scoffed. Passion doesn't make up for proper training. Did you see her violin? Probably picked it up at a garage sale. Maria froze, her hand on the door handle. And can you imagine the janitor sitting in the audience next to the Thompsons or the Prescotts? Carlos is a nice man, but really... Maria pushed through the door, not waiting to hear more. The cool autumn air hit her tear-streaked face as she ran toward the parking lot where her father waited. Carlos took one look at her face and opened his arms. Maria collapsed against his work shirt, breathing in the familiar scent of cleaning supplies and the faint hint of the aftershave he wore on special occasions. That bad, huh? He asked softly, stroking her hair. Maria couldn't bring herself to repeat what she'd heard. Instead, she just held tighter to her father. This man who worked so hard, who believed in her so completely, who deserved better than to be dismissed as just the janitor. I don't want to go back, she whispered. Carlos gently pulled back to look at her. What happened, Pequeña? I'm not good enough, Maria said, the words catching in her throat. I never will be. Carlos studied her face for a long moment. Then instead of starting the truck, he reached for his phone. Who are you calling? Maria asked, wiping her eyes. An old friend, Carlos replied, a determined look crossing his weathered features. It's time to show them who you really are. Carlos drove home in silence, glancing occasionally at his daughter who sat staring out the window, her violin case clutched tightly in her lap. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, but Maria seemed blind to the beauty around her. Her shoulders were slumped in a way that made Carlos's heart ache. When they reached their small apartment, Maria headed straight to her room. Carlos heard the soft click of her door closing, but no music followed. No violin practice, which had been her evening ritual for years. The silence worried him more than tears would have. Carlos waited until he heard the shower running before making another phone call. He paced the tiny kitchen as he spoke in rapid Spanish, his voice hushed but urgent. By the time Maria emerged from her room in pajamas, her damp hair twisted into a braid, Carlos was sitting at their small dining table with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Come, he said, patting the chair beside him. We need to talk. Maria slid into the seat, wrapping her hands around the warm mug without drinking. I don't want to talk about today. Then we won't, Carlos said simply. But I do want to tell you a story, one I should have shared a long time ago. Maria looked up, curiosity momentarily pushing aside her sadness. You know, I grew up in a small village outside of Mexico City, Carlos began. What I've never told you is that I wasn't always going to be a janitor. What do you mean? Carlos took a sip of his chocolate before continuing. I was going to be a musician. A guitarist. Maria's eyes widened. You never told me that. It was too painful to talk about for a long time, Carlos admitted. But I think you need to hear it now. He told her about growing up poor but happy, about learning guitar from his uncle who played in local restaurants, how he practiced for hours after finishing his chores, how his fingers bled before they calloused, how at 17, he had the opportunity to audition for a music program in Mexico City that offered full scholarships to talented students from rural areas. I was so nervous, Carlos recalled, his eyes distant with memory. My clothes were worn, my guitar wasn't fancy, and the other students looked at me like I didn't belong there. Maria leaned forward, recognizing her own experience in her father's words. There was another boy from my village, Carlos continued, Antonio Vasquez. We grew up together, practiced together. He played violin. What happened? Maria asked when her father paused. The day before our auditions, there was an accident, a bus crash. Carlos rubbed his right hand unconsciously. My hand was badly injured. The doctors said I would never play professionally. Maria reached out, taking her father's hand in hers. The scars were faint now, but still visible, thin white lines crisscrossing his palm and fingers. Antonio stayed with me in the hospital instead of going to his audition, Carlos said. I made him promise to go the next day. He didn't want to leave me, but I insisted. Did he go? Carlos nodded, a small smile breaking through his somber expression. He did, and he was accepted. The program changed his life. What happened to him? He became very successful, traveled the world playing with famous orchestras. Even now at 55, he still performs. Do you still talk to him? Maria asked. Not often, but we never lost touch completely. Carlos squeezed her hand. That's who I called today. Maria blinked in surprise. Why? Because Antonio is in the city right now. He's performing with the symphony this weekend. Carlos's eyes lit up with determination, and he's coming here tomorrow morning. Here? To our apartment? Maria looked around at their modest living space with alarm. Carlos chuckled. Don't worry. He grew up in a house with dirt floors and chickens running through the kitchen. He won't mind our little place, but why is he coming? To meet you, Carlos said simply. And to hear you play. Maria shook her head, pulling her hand away. No, I can't. You didn't hear those teachers, Dad. They were right. I don't have proper training. I don't belong in their world. Those teachers, Carlos said, his voice suddenly hard, know nothing about music if they can't hear the talent you have. Antonio will hear it. I know he will. Even if he does, what good will it do? The audition is over. Trust me, Carlos said, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind Maria's ear. Just trust me. The next morning, Maria woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of unfamiliar laughter coming from the kitchen. She quickly dressed in her best non-school clothes, a simple blue dress and the small silver necklace that had belonged to her mother. When she emerged from her room, she found her father sitting at the table with a distinguished-looking man. He was tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He wore jeans and a casual button-down shirt, not at all what Maria had expected from a famous violinist. "Ah, there she is," Carlos said, standing. "Maria, this is my old friend Antonio Vasquez." Antonio stood as well, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Maria. Your father has told me so much about you." Maria shook his hand shyly. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. Please call me Antonio." "Sir makes me feel ancient," he said with a warm smile. "I understand you play violin?" Maria nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Not as well as you?" "Well, I've been playing for nearly 50 years, so I'd hope I've learned a thing or two." Antonio laughed. "But your father tells me you've taught yourself, which I find remarkable." Maria glanced at her father, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Would you play something for me?" Antonio asked. "I'd love to hear you," Maria hesitated. "My violin isn't very good." "The violin doesn't make the musician," Antonio said gently. "Some of the most beautiful music I've ever heard came from instruments that most professionals would turn their noses up at." Reluctantly, Maria retrieved her violin. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned it under her chin. She took a deep breath and began to play the same Vivaldi piece she had performed at the audition. This time, in the comfort of her own home, with no judgmental teachers watching, Maria played with even more feeling. The music filled their small apartment, bouncing off the walls and seemingly transforming the space into something grander. When she finished, she lowered her violin and looked nervously at Antonio, who had closed his eyes while listening. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Carlos. "You were right," he said quietly. "She has a gift." Relief washed over Maria. Antonio turned to her with a serious expression. "Your technique needs refinement," he said honestly. "There are habits you've developed that will need to be corrected. But the musicality, the emotion you bring to the piece, that cannot be taught. That comes from within." "The teachers at my school didn't think I was good enough," Maria admitted. Antonio's expression darkened slightly. "Unfortunately, some people in the music world value pedigree over passion. They forget that music is meant to move people, not just impress them." He reached for his own violin case, which Maria hadn't noticed sitting by the door. The case was worn leather, clearly old but well cared for. Inside was a beautiful violin that glowed with a rich amber color. "This was my first real violin," Antonio explained. "I've kept it all these years." He lifted it carefully and positioned it. "Let me show you something." Antonio played the same Vivaldi piece Maria had just performed. His version was technically flawless, each note precisely where it should be, each phrase flowing into the next with perfect control. When he finished, he looked at Maria expectantly. "That was amazing," she breathed. "It was correct," Antonio corrected her. "Now let me play it again." The second time, something changed. The notes were the same, but they soared and dipped with newfound emotion. Antonio swayed slightly as he played, his expression transforming as though the music was flowing through him rather than from him. When the final note faded, Maria found herself blinking back tears. "That," Antonio said softly, "is the difference between playing the notes and playing the music. You already know how to play the music, Maria. I can teach you the rest. You would teach me?" Maria asked incredulously. Antonio nodded. "I'm in town for 2 months, working with the symphony on a special program. I can give you lessons 3 times a week." "We can't afford," Carlos began. But Antonio waved his hand dismissively. "Consider it repayment for all those years ago, when you convinced me not to give up." He turned to Maria. "And I have another proposal. The symphony is hosting a young musicians showcase next month. With some intensive work, you could be ready to perform." Maria's heart raced with excitement, but then reality came crashing back. "What about the school showcase?" "The results will be posted on Monday." Antonio and Carlos exchanged a look that Maria couldn't interpret. "Let's cross that bridge when we come to it," Antonio said. "For now, let's focus on your first proper lesson. Shall we begin?" For the next 2 hours, Maria experienced what real musical instruction felt like. Antonio was patient but demanding, correcting her hand position, showing her how to hold the bow more efficiently, teaching her exercises to strengthen her fingers. By the time he left, promising to return on Tuesday, Maria felt both exhausted and exhilarated. For the first time since the disastrous audition, hope flickered in her chest. "Dad," she said as they waved goodbye to Antonio from their apartment window, "how did you afford my violin?" "The truth this time." Carlos sighed, putting his arm around her shoulders. "I worked nights cleaning offices downtown, but it was worth every hour to see you play like you do." Maria leaned against her father's sturdy shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the violin? For never letting me give up." Monday morning arrived with a mixture of dread and anticipation. As Carlos drove Maria to school, he seemed unusually cheerful, humming along to the radio. "Whatever happens with the showcase list," he told her as they pulled up to the drop-off area, "remember what Antonio said. You have a gift that no one can take away from you." Maria nodded, clutching the wooden violin charm he had given her on the first day. "I know, Dad. I'll see you after school." As she walked through the main entrance, Maria steeled herself for disappointment, but she held her head higher than she had the week before. No matter what Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner thought of her playing, she now knew the truth. She had talent worth nurturing. The showcase list would be posted outside the auditorium. Maria took a deep breath and headed toward the music department, ready to face whatever came next. The hallways of Westfield Academy buzzed with Monday morning energy. Students huddled around lockers, comparing weekend activities and complaining about upcoming tests. Maria moved through the crowd like a ghost, her mind focused on one destination, the bulletin board outside the auditorium. As she approached the music department, a knot formed in her stomach. A small crowd had already gathered around the showcase list, some students celebrating with excited hugs while others walked away with disappointed faces. Maria hung back, waiting for the crowd to thin before approaching. Just as she was about to step forward, Alex appeared beside her. "Hey, violin girl," he greeted her with a smile. "Come to check the list?" Maria nodded, too nervous to speak. "I'll go with you," he offered, seeming to sense her anxiety. They approached the bulletin board together. The winter showcase program was printed on cream-colored paper, with the school's emblem at the top. Maria scanned the list of names, her heart pounding. "There you are," Alex said, pointing halfway down the list. "Maria Hernandez, Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons First Movement." Maria blinked in disbelief. "That can't be right. Why not? You were good. But Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner—" She trailed off, remembering their dismissive comments. "Must have been overruled," Alex said with a shrug. "Dean Wilson is the one who makes the final decisions, and he was nodding during your whole audition." Maria read her name again, making sure it wasn't a mistake. There it was, printed clearly between Alexander Chen, Paganini Caprice No. 24, and Lily Tran, Chopin Nocturne in E-flat major. "Congratulations," Alex said, bumping her shoulder lightly with his. "See you at rehearsal on Wednesday." In a daze, Maria made her way to her first class. Throughout the day, she found it impossible to focus on lessons. Her mind kept returning to the showcase list, to Antonio's offer to teach her, to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she did belong at Westfield after all. By lunchtime, word had spread that the janitor's daughter had made it into the showcase. Maria could feel the stares as she sat alone at a cafeteria table, picking at her sandwich. "Is this seat taken?" Maria looked up to see a girl from her English class, Lily, the pianist who would be performing Chopin in the showcase. "No," Maria said, surprised. Lily sat down, arranging her lunch tray neatly. "I heard you play on Friday. You've got a different style than most people here." Maria tensed, waiting for criticism. "Different bad?" "Different interesting," Lily clarified. "Most of us sound the same. Perfect technique, but what? Sometimes it feels like we're just robots playing exactly what our teachers tell us to play, exactly how they tell us to play it." Lily lowered her voice. "Don't tell anyone I said that. My mom would flip out. She's been pushing me to become a concert pianist since I was 4. The conversation with Lily made the rest of the day more bearable. By the time the final bell rang, Maria felt almost optimistic as she headed to meet her father in the parking lot. Carlos was waiting in his usual spot, still wearing his work uniform. His face broke into a wide grin when he saw her. "Well?" he asked as she climbed into the truck. "I made it," Maria said, still finding it hard to believe. "My name was on the list." Carlos whooped with joy, pulling her into a tight hug. "I knew it! I knew they would see your talent." "Dad, it doesn't make sense," Maria said. "They were so dismissive at the audition." Carlos's expression turned mysterious. Maybe someone helped them see things differently. Before Maria could question him further, he changed the subject. "Antonio is coming for your lesson tomorrow. He wants to work on your showcase piece." The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of school, rehearsals, and lessons with Antonio. 3 times a week, the renowned violinist visited their small apartment, patiently working with Maria on her technique while nurturing the natural musicality he saw in her. "Your greatest strength," he told her during their 4th lesson, "is that you feel the music in your soul. Most students your age are so focused on playing perfectly that they forget to play beautifully." At school, Maria attended the weekly showcase rehearsals supervised by Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner. While they were never outright rude, they largely ignored her, focusing their attention on students they deemed more promising. Maria didn't mind. The less they interfered with her playing, the more she could apply what Antonio was teaching her. Gradually, things began to change at school as well. Lily introduced Maria to her circle of friends, fellow musicians who were curious about the girl who had taught herself to play. Alex often sought her out between classes, once even inviting her to join him and some friends at a local cafe after school. "I can't today," Maria had told him reluctantly. "I have a lesson." She hadn't told anyone about Antonio. Somehow it felt like a special secret between her and her father, a precious gift she wasn't ready to share. At home, Carlos beamed with pride watching Maria's progress. One evening after Antonio had left following a particularly productive lesson, Carlos presented her with a small box. "What's this?" Maria asked, opening it to find a beautiful amber rosin for her bow. "A gift from Antonio and me," Carlos explained, "for how hard you've been working." Maria hugged her father tightly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." The night before the showcase, Maria could barely sleep. She tossed and turned, playing her piece over and over in her mind. What if she made a mistake? What if she embarrassed herself in front of the whole school? What if Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner had been right all along? At dawn, she finally gave up on sleep and quietly took out her violin. In the soft morning light filtering through her bedroom window, she played her piece one last time, pouring all her fears and hopes into the music. When she finished, she heard a soft knock on her door. "That was beautiful," Carlos said, entering with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, "just like your mother used to play." "I'm scared, Dad," Maria admitted, setting down her violin to accept the warm drink. "Being scared means you care," Carlos told her. "Use that feeling. Let it fuel your music." That evening, the Westfield Academy auditorium was transformed. Soft lighting cast a warm glow over the stage, and the seats were filled with well-dressed parents, faculty members, and students. Programs were handed out at the door, glossy booklets featuring each performer's name and selection. Backstage, chaos reigned as performers adjusted bow ties, tuned instruments, and paced nervously. Maria stood alone in a corner, wearing the simple black dress Carlos had bought for the occasion. It wasn't as fancy as what the other girls were wearing, but it was new and fit perfectly. "You look beautiful," a voice said behind her. Maria turned to see Alex, handsome in a dark suit, his hair for once not perfectly styled. "You clean up nice yourself," she replied with a nervous smile. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified, me too. And I've been doing these showcases since I was 8. He gave her an encouraging smile. "You'll be amazing. Just play like you did at the audition, like you mean it." A stagehand appeared, calling for quiet as the showcase was about to begin. One by one, performers were called to the stage. Maria watched from the wings, her anxiety growing with each flawless performance. Lily played her Chopin piece beautifully, her fingers dancing over the keys with practiced precision. Alex's Paganini was technically brilliant, drawing enthusiastic applause, and then it was Maria's turn. Next, we have Maria Hernandez performing the first movement of Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons, announced Dean Wilson, a kind-faced man in his 60s who had taken a special interest in the showcase. Maria walked onto the stage, her legs feeling like jelly. The bright lights momentarily blinded her, but as her eyes adjusted, she could make out faces in the audience. She saw her father in the third row, looking both proud and nervous. Beside him sat Antonio, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. And then, in the front row, she spotted Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner, their expressions carefully neutral. Maria positioned her violin, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few notes came out shaky, but as she continued, something magical happened. The weeks of lessons with Antonio, the hours of practice, the emotional connection she had always had with her music, everything came together in that moment. She played not just with technical skill, though Antonio had significantly improved that aspect of her performance, but with heart. Each note told a story of winter winds and falling snow, of her mother whom she barely remembered, of her father's sacrifices, of finding her place in a world that had tried to exclude her. The audience disappeared. The lights faded. There was only Maria and her violin and the music that flowed between them like an electric current. When she played the final note, the auditorium remained silent for a heartbeat. Then thunderous applause erupted, catching Maria by surprise. She opened her eyes to see the audience on their feet, a standing ovation. In the front row, Dean Wilson was applauding enthusiastically. Beside him, Ms. Walsh's mouth had fallen slightly open in shock. Mr. Tanner was clapping slowly, his expression unreadable. But it was her father's face that Maria sought out. Carlos stood with tears streaming unashamedly down his cheeks, his hands red from clapping so hard. Beside him, Antonio was beaming with pride. As Maria took her bow and walked off stage on trembling legs, she knew something had changed forever. The girl who had entered Westfield Academy 3 weeks ago, uncertain, apologetic, feeling like an imposter, was gone. In her place stood a musician who had found her voice and wasn't afraid to use it. Backstage was a flurry of activity as performers waited for their turn or returned, flushed with accomplishment. When Maria stepped off the stage, still dazed from her performance, she was immediately surrounded by fellow students. "That was incredible," Lily exclaimed, her eyes wide with genuine admiration. "How did you make it sound like that?" another student asked. Like the violin was actually speaking. Maria barely had time to catch her breath before Alex appeared, grinning from ear to ear. "You just stole the show," he told her, giving her a quick, impulsive hug. Dean Wilson approached, his kind face wreathed in smiles. "Magnificent performance. Ms. Hernandez, truly exceptional." "Thank you, sir," Maria managed, still overwhelmed by the response. As the other students drifted away to prepare for the remaining performances, Maria found a quiet corner backstage. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline, her heart still racing. She had done it, really done it. And not just performed, but excelled. The remainder of the showcase passed in a blur. Maria watched the other performances, but her mind kept returning to the moment she had finished playing, to the sound of applause washing over her like a wave. After the final performance, Dean Wilson returned to the stage to thank everyone for attending. "I would especially like to recognize the exceptional talent we've witnessed tonight," he said. "These young musicians represent the future of classical music. And based on what we've heard this evening, that future is bright indeed." As the audience began to disperse, Maria made her way through the crowd, searching for her father. She found Carlos waiting near the stage door, his face still glowing with pride. "Pequeña," he whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You were perfect." "Thanks, Dad," Maria said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without you." When they separated, Maria saw Antonio approaching, accompanied by several well-dressed people she didn't recognize. "Maria," Antonio said warmly, "that was exceptional. I'd like to introduce you to some friends of mine." The next few minutes were a whirlwind as Maria shook hands with members of the symphony board, the director of a prestigious summer music program, and a professor from the city's renowned conservatory. They asked about her training, her plans for the future, her aspirations as a musician. Maria answered as best she could, still riding the high of her performance. "We should talk about your future development," the conservatory professor told her, handing her father a business card. "Talent like yours needs proper nurturing." As the group moved away, promising to be in touch, Maria caught sight of Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner standing a short distance away. They appeared to be in a heated discussion with Dean Wilson. Though she couldn't hear their words, the tension in their faces was clear. Don't worry about them, Antonio said, following her gaze. Dean Wilson is setting a few things straight. Maria was about to ask what he meant when Alex appeared at her side, now accompanied by an elegantly dressed couple who could only be his parents. Mom, Dad, this is Maria, he said. The violinist I was telling you about. Your performance was breathtaking, Alex's mother said warmly. Thank you, Maria replied, suddenly self-conscious. Alex tells us you're self-taught, his father said. Is that true? Before Maria could answer, Carlos stepped forward. Maria taught herself for many years, he explained. But recently she's been studying with Antonio Vasquez. Alex's parents' eyes widened at the mention of Antonio's name. The Antonio Vasquez? His father asked. With the National Symphony? Antonio smiled modestly. The very same. And I must say, in all my years of teaching, I've rarely encountered a student with Maria's natural musicality. The conversation continued, with Alex's parents growing increasingly impressed. They invited Carlos and Maria to join them for dinner to celebrate the successful showcase. Maria looked to her father, who nodded his approval. We'd be delighted, Carlos said. As they were preparing to leave, Dean Wilson approached their group. Mr. Hernandez, could I have a word? He asked. And you too, Maria, if you don't mind. Carlos and Maria stepped aside with the dean, who lowered his voice. I want to apologize for what happened during your audition. Maria, it has come to my attention that certain faculty members did not treat you with the respect you deserve. Maria glanced at her father, who avoided her gaze. Had he said something to Dean Wilson? Antonio brought the situation to my attention, Dean Wilson continued, answering her unspoken question. We've had a thorough discussion with Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner about our expectations for how all students should be treated at Westfield. It's okay, Maria said, uncomfortable with the situation. It doesn't matter anymore. It does matter, Dean Wilson insisted gently. Talent and dedication should be recognized regardless of background. Your father is an essential member of our Westfield community, and you are a gifted student who deserves every opportunity we can provide. He turned to Carlos. Mr. Hernandez, I want you to know how deeply we value your contribution to our school. The respect and dignity with which you perform your job is an example to our students. Carlos nodded, clearly moved by the dean's words. Now Dean Wilson said, his tone lightening. I believe you have a dinner celebration to attend. But before you go, I'd like to mention that we're expanding our music scholarship program next year. Maria, given your performance tonight, I'd like to offer you a full scholarship for the remainder of your time at Westfield. Maria's jaw dropped. Really? Really, Dean Wilson confirmed. Your talent has earned it. As they walked away, Maria whispered to her father, Did you know about this? Carlos shook his head. Not about the scholarship. But I may have had a small talk with Antonio about what happened at your audition, and he may have had a word with Dean Wilson. Dad, Maria exclaimed. You shouldn't have. Yes, I should have, Carlos interrupted firmly. It wasn't right how they treated you. Sometimes standing up for yourself means accepting help from those who care about you. Before they could discuss it further, they reached the exit where Antonio, Alex, and his parents were waiting. As they walked to the parking lot together, Maria noticed Ms. Walsh and Mr. Tanner emerging from the building. The two teachers paused when they saw Maria's group. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with what appeared to be a gentle nudge from Dean Wilson, who had followed them out, Ms. Walsh approached. Ms. Hernandez, she said formally, I wanted to congratulate you on your performance tonight. Thank you, Maria replied, unsure what else to say. It seems, Ms. Walsh continued, choosing her words carefully, that I may have been hasty in my assessment of your abilities. Mr. Tanner stepped forward as well. Your performance tonight showed considerable improvement from your audition. Perhaps there is something to be said for unconventional training methods. It wasn't quite an apology, but Maria could see the effort it took for them to acknowledge their misjudgment. She nodded, accepting their words for what they were. I've had an excellent teacher, she said, glancing at Antonio. As the teachers walked away, Antonio chuckled. That's about as close to we were wrong as you'll ever hear from those two. The dinner celebration lasted well into the evening. At a restaurant far fancier than any Maria had ever visited, they toasted her success and discussed her newfound opportunities. The conservatory professor had mentioned a youth orchestra that met on weekends. Antonio suggested she apply to prestigious summer programs. Alex's parents offer,